When Russian forces crossed into Ukraine on February 24, 2022, Russian President Vladimir Putin expected his special military operation to last 3 days, maybe a few weeks at most. The Ukrainian government, he theorized, would collapse with a decisive early strike, the military would surrender, and Russian flags would fly over Kyiv before NATO could even respond. Game, set, match. But 3.5 years later, Ukraine not only survived the initial onslaught, but it's systematically dismantling what was supposed to be the world's second most powerful military. And it's costing Russia everything. So let's look at how Ukraine outplayed Putin at nearly every turn, and the heavy toll Russia is about to pay. Now, when we look back at the start of the invasion, Putin's plan was pulled straight from Russian classic military textbooks, a move that turned out to be Ukraine's greatest advantage. Ukraine had spent decades as part of the Soviet Union, so Ukrainian commanders knew exactly how Russia operated. And on day one of the invasion, they used that knowledge to deliver a devastating blow. The Battle of Hostomel Airport should have been Russia's triumph. The strategy was simple and elegant. Between 200 and 300 Russian paratroopers on 34 helicopters would swoop in to capture the airport just miles from Kyiv. Russia would then use Kyiv's airport to create an air tunnel to funnel troops directly into the capital. It was the same playbook Russia had used successfully in Czechoslovakia in 1968, Afghanistan in 1979, and even Crimea in 2014. But Ukraine was ready. Instead of an empty airport, Russian forces ran into manned portable air defense systems, a Zu-23 anti-aircraft gun, and a runway deliberately blocked with old vehicles and scrap aircraft. Ukraine's radar network, which was coincidentally the largest ground-based radar-guided air defense network in Europe, due to leftover equipment precisely from its Soviet roots, had been hardened against Russian electronic warfare through NATO cooperation. When those Russian helicopters arrived, they flew into a kill zone. Even though Russians eventually captured the airport, it was too late. The airstrip was destroyed, the air tunnel never materialized, and Putin's 3-day war turned into a grinding siege of Kyiv that Russia would ultimately lose within 5 weeks. This pattern of exploiting Russian predictability would repeat throughout the war, but never more spectacularly than in September 2022. By summer 2022, Russia had captured the strategic city of Izium and established it as a major forward operating base with approximately 18,000 troops. The city served as a critical logistics hub, with railway lines running from Russia to Kupiansk and then to Izium. Control of Izium meant Russia could efficiently supply its entire northern front. But Ukrainian General Alexander Sersky was quietly preparing a masterpiece of military deception. Throughout July and August, Ukrainian and Russian media both talked endlessly about a major Ukrainian counter-offensive in Kherson Oblast in the south. On August 29, Ukraine officially announced the long-anticipated Kherson offensive had begun. Russia frantically redeployed its best units southward, reducing forces in Izium by at least half. It was all a ruse. On September 6, Ukrainian forces launched their real offensive in Kharkiv Oblast, taking Russian forces completely by surprise. The advance was devastating, as Ukrainian troops moved an average of 4.6 miles per day, making it the fastest offensive operation in over a century of warfare. Within 6 days, Ukraine had recaptured over 1,150 square miles of territory, liberated dozens of towns, including the strategic cities of Izium and Kupiansk, and captured or destroyed hundreds of pieces of Russian military equipment. Russian forces simply fled, abandoning ammunition depots, tanks, artillery, and even newly deployed equipment. Some Russian units were completely lost, marking the first time since World War II that whole Russian formations had vanished in a single battle. All the while, Russian soldiers were fleeing from Ukrainian forces in northeast Ukraine, while citizens in Moscow were partying to celebrate the city's 875th anniversary, completely disconnected from the disaster unfolding on the battlefield. If the Kharkiv counter-offensive proved Ukraine could win on defense, the August 2024 Kursk incursion demonstrated something even more audacious. Ukraine could invade Russia itself. The operation was bold to the point of recklessness. Ukraine diverted precious forces from defensive positions to launch a cross-border attack, capturing roughly 480 square miles of Russian territory in Kursk Oblast. For reference, this was more territory than Russia had managed to capture in all of 2024 up to that point. The strategic brilliance was multi-layered. First, it shattered the myth that Russian territory was invulnerable to Ukrainian counterattacks. Second, it forced Russia to divert approximately 50,000 troops away from other fronts, staggering Russian offensive plans by weeks or months. Third, and perhaps most importantly, it demolished Western hesitation about providing Ukraine with advanced long-range weapons. This last point was vital because for the previous months, NATO had been reluctant to allow Ukraine to strike deep into Russian territory with Western weapons, citing Russian nuclear threats as the primary reason. But since Ukraine invaded Russia using its own forces and Putin didn't launch nuclear weapons, that entire calculation changed. Within months, F-16s, Mirage 2000s, and advanced missile systems were flowing into Ukraine, all with permission to strike targets inside Russia. The Kursk incursion remained contested for well over half a year, with Ukrainian forces still controlling portions of the territory as late as June 2025. Russia stooped so low as to, allegedly, employ North Korean troops to reinforce the counter-offensive. The Korean troops were laughably incompetent in that task, and Russia showcased just how much its military is actually lacking compared to its on-paper statistics. But perhaps Ukraine's most transformative innovation has been its revolution in drone warfare. In 2022, Ukraine's domestic defense industry was worth around $1 billion. By 2025, it had exploded to $35 billion in capacity, with Ukraine now producing roughly one-third of all weapons and ammunition used by its armed forces. In critical areas like drone production, that figure reaches nearly 100%. While everyone would like to think it was pure genius, this transformation happened out of pure desperation. But the results speak for themselves. By early 2025, drones accounted for approximately 70% of all Russian battlefield casualties, and in some cases reached as much as 80%. Ukraine has developed everything from small FPV drones costing a few $1,000s that can destroy million-dollar tanks, to naval drones that force Russia's Black Sea Fleet to abandon Crimea, to long-range drones capable of striking targets hundreds of miles deep into Russian territory. Now, the crown jewel of this campaign was Operation Spiderweb in June 2025, where Ukraine struck 5 Russian air bases simultaneously, damaging or destroying roughly one-third of Russia's strategic bomber fleet. These were precision attacks reaching deep into Russia's heartland, demonstrating that nowhere in Russia is safe from Ukrainian retaliation. The attack was conducted using simple FPV drones, enhanced through mobile networks to provide real-time video transmission and manual control over vast distances, while embedding control signals amidst civilian data traffic, rendering them very difficult to detect and disrupt. Most importantly, this drone revolution didn't come from Western donations alone. While systems like the US Phoenix Ghost, Switchblade 600, and Jump 20 provided critical early capabilities, Ukraine built on these foundations using a domestic distributed network of over 900 suppliers ranging from major companies to garage workshops. When one workshop discovers an improvement, that info is spread across the entire network within days through systems like the Brave One Information Coordination Platform. This decentralized innovation cycle moves at speeds traditional military-industrial complexes can't match. Prototypes are developed, tested in actual combat, and deployed as final products within months rather than the years it takes conventional defense contractors. Still, those innovations would have been impossible without Western support, buying them time. The weapons that arrived from NATO were lifelines that kept Ukraine in the fight long enough to develop its own capabilities. When the first high-mobility artillery rocket systems, or HIMARS, arrived in June 2022, they could deliver 200-pound guided warheads anywhere within 50 miles, hitting within 10 feet of the target. Before HIMARS, Ukraine was fighting with Soviet-era artillery that took minutes to set up and had half the range. The US has shipped around 40 HIMARS launchers, and Ukraine has quickly used them to attack more than 350 Russian command posts, ammunition dumps, and supply depots. Each successful strike has multiplier effects, as destroying a single ammunition depot can reduce Russian artillery fire across an entire sector for weeks. Now, when Putin unleashed his supposedly invincible Kinzhal hypersonic missiles, Ukrainian Patriot batteries calmly shot them down. In November 2024, a Patriot battery in Kyiv intercepted a salvo of Russian hypersonic missiles, which would have previously been impossible with solely domestic equipment. Ukraine has received 7 Patriot batteries, and while each PAC-3 MSE missile costs $4 million, they've proven essential for protecting Ukrainian cities and military infrastructure. But it's the arrival of the first F-16s in August 2024 that gave Ukraine its first real shot at contesting Russia. At first, on their way to becoming museum pieces, slowly getting obsoleted thanks to F-35 orders across Europe, they were still modern fighters equipped with advanced defensive systems. By receiving a midlife overhaul to make them compatible with contemporary weapons, they created a more advanced aerial presence for Ukraine. And Ukrainian pilots adapted quickly. In one sortie, a Ukrainian F-16 shot down 6 Russian cruise missiles, using the aircraft's cannon to destroy 2 of them. By early 2025, France's Mirage 2005 fighters joined the fleet, providing additional redundancy and capabilities. Other important weapons were Bradley infantry support vehicles, and even long-range missiles like the Javelin or Storm Shadow. While expensive and impossible to utilize perfectly by Ukrainian forces, they bought vital time for Ukraine's domestic industry and strategy to come true and turn the tide of the war by 2023. There's one thing that's brutally clear for Ukraine, even if it keeps using the same strategy that's proven to be so impressive and effective as before. Ukraine simply can't win a war of attrition based on manpower alone. Of course, when asked, one Ukrainian commander suggested that we've been at war with the Russians for 300 years, we can hold on for a while longer. But holding on requires more than determination. It requires systematic adaptation to minimize casualties while maximizing the costs Russia pays for every advance. Ukrainian commanders are now taking measures that may sound rudimentary, but aren't implemented systematically across all of Russia's forces. Better rotation plans to prevent burnout, more careful use of artillery to avoid counter-battery fire, more precise troop movements guided by drone reconnaissance, and command posts located in private homes that can be evacuated instantly if discovered. This led to a somewhat paradoxical scenario of Ukraine not using as many troops near the front line. Russian drones would end up chasing a single person who sticks out against the landscape. Clearly, not a good use of thousands of dollars of technology. Ukraine has also become dependent on ground drones, including remotely driven robots that run on wheels, tracks, or even legs. Used for resupplying and evacuating troops, these drones often travel more than 10 miles without stopping. The reasoning is quite simple. The skies now belong to FPV drones for both sides, and every human on the ground is at risk of being attacked. Vehicles leave too much of a trail behind them and are visible to sensors for infrared and thermal tracking. Ground drones fill a niche between these extremes, allowing Ukraine to resupply and communicate across ground when needed. This combination of drone warfare, careful tactical planning, and Western-supplied precision weapons has fundamentally changed the battlefield dynamic. Ukraine can't match Russia's ability to throw waves of soldiers at problems, but it can make every Russian advance so costly in equipment, ammunition, and lives that Russia's numerical advantages become irrelevant. And the data proves the strategy is working. By early 2025, Russian territorial gains had plummeted dramatically. Russia seized just 78 square miles in March 2025, down from 165 in January. Even more telling, Russia needed over 35 assaults per square kilometer captured in March, up from just 7.1 in November 2024. Essentially, Russia needs to perform 5 times as many offensive operations to gain any territorial advantage compared to just 6 months earlier. And while Ukraine adapts and innovates, Russia is hemorrhaging. According to some Western intelligence agencies, Russia's already lost more than half of its available military hardware. Open source intelligence group Oryx has documented close to 23,000 units of Russian military equipment destroyed, damaged, or captured, compared to Ukraine's 10,000. These aren't losses Russia can easily replace. About 50% of Russia's lost equipment comes from Soviet-era stockpiles amassed over decades. Those stockpiles are finite and depleting at an alarming rate. Russia started the war with roughly 12,000 tanks. It's now pulling progressively older equipment from storage. After starting with T-72s and T-80s, Russia moved to T-62s by May 2022, with late 2024 seeing T-34s reappear on transports and training grounds, tanks not used since World War II. While they haven't been confirmed in combat, their return likely serves propaganda purposes rather than actual deployment. Military analyst Andriy Tarasenko warns that Russia's repairable equipment reserves could be exhausted within 12 to 18 months unless production increases to 700 to 1,000 armored vehicles annually. The problem is that Russia can only produce about 250 T-90M tanks and 460 BMP-3 infantry fighting vehicles per year. which is far less than it loses. At the same time, Russia is also hemorrhaging money to fund its war machine. Russia's oil and gas revenues, which historically accounted for 30 to 50% of government income, dropped for as much as 35% year over year in May 2025. This is the same year where defense spending eats through 40% of the entire federal budget, something no country has done since the Soviet era, except for its current opponent, Ukraine. Putin has been forced to announce that military spending will be reduced by an almost two-digit percentage for 2026, essentially admitting Russia can't sustain the current tempo. The reason for this is threefold. Ukraine's systematic drone strikes on Russian oil refineries cost Russia roughly 17% of its refining capacity, directly correlating with a similar level of decline in oil and gas production and revenue. Then, the European Union's price cap dropped Russian crude from $60 per barrel to under $48, with Ural crude crashing from nearly $70 per barrel to $50 in a year. With the EU planning to eliminate Russian imports by 2027, Russia is losing its primary export market. Finally, Russia has turned to China and India, but at a devastating cost. China now demands up to a 40% discount compared to the prices Russia commanded from the EU. And Russia has been forced to use a shadow fleet of ships registered under fake names to avoid Western sanctions, skyrocketing transportation costs and reduced profitability. Russia has also suffered over 1.1 million casualties since the war began. Worse yet, Russia's daily casualty rate has increased steadily from 300 soldiers per day at the war's start to over 1,300 in March of 2025. If this rate continues, Russia could suffer another 440,000 casualties annually, which would only accelerate the need for retraining and exacerbate other economic issues. And Russia can't really replace these losses. Enlistment rates dropped by as much as 80% from 2024 to early 2025. Russia has almost exhausted its prisoner supply and has been forced to request not one but two waves of North Korean troops, which was already a desperate measure that barely makes a dent in the overall manpower shortage. The demographic impact extends far beyond the battlefield. Russia's military in 2025 represents 3% of the country's labor force, a 40% increase from 2020. Working-age men are systematically removed from the workforce, often permanently. Combined with Russia's catastrophically low fertility rate from the 1990s onward, Russia is missing an entire generation of young adults who would be joining the workforce and forming families. One analysis suggests the number of workers between ages 16 and 35 dropped by 1.33 million in 2022 alone. The Russian military-industrial complex itself faces a shortage of up to 120,000 engineers, with total manpower shortfalls estimated at 400,000. Russia's military exports, once a major source of revenue and geopolitical influence, have also collapsed, with an estimated 92% reduction between 2021 and 2024. Russia has failed to properly insulate its industry from needing imports, so Western sanctions prohibited creating advanced systems to keep parity with Ukrainian defenses. But even more telling is Russia's lack of progress in a war that should have been easy. When the supposedly high-end and cutting-edge weapons can't make a dent in a country that has a fraction of the military budget, troop size, and even equipment count, buyers lose confidence in them. As such, Russia's relationships with its few remaining allies are becoming increasingly one-sided. China extracts massive discounts on Russian energy exports and uses Russia as a cautionary tale about challenging Western economic dominance. North Korea sends defective ammunition and conscripts for Russian meat grinder tactics. Iran provides drones at a high markup to fund its own war effort, but watches Russia's military reputation crumble. Meanwhile, NATO has strengthened dramatically in response to Russian aggression. Sweden and Finland join NATO, further cutting off Russia's access to Baltic Sea ports. Germany has agreed that its military expenditure will account for 5% of its GDP by 2035, in line with Trump's demands from the start of 2025. Roughly 30% of that is likely to be dedicated to infrastructure that benefits all of Central Europe, further cementing the cross-country cooperation that makes NATO even more impervious to Russian demands. Forbes calculated that at Russia's April 2025 rate of progress, capturing only 68 square miles of Ukrainian territory per month, it would take approximately 230 years to occupy all of Ukraine. At the current casualty rate of up to 1,200 soldiers per day, that would require roughly 100 million Russian casualties. That's 70% of Russia's current population. Obviously, the war won't last 230 years. Something has to give, and all evidence suggests it will be Russia's military capacity, not Ukraine's will to fight. What makes Ukraine's performance even more remarkable is the scale of what NATO hasn't provided. The F-16s donated to Ukraine were aircraft destined for scrapyards. There are no advanced F-22s or F-35s flying for Ukraine, which would bring their advanced stealth capabilities and weapon compatibility for even more punch. The US Air Force itself has around 1,600 fighter jets, so Ukraine's 90 or so is a tiny fraction. The missile batteries and long-range missiles are technically also production surpluses that NATO can restock within years, not active frontline equipment. Yet these surplus weapons, combined with Ukrainian innovation and tactical brilliance, have been enough to bring Russia, which was supposedly the world's second most powerful military, to the brink of defeat. The lessons are clear for anyone studying modern warfare. Decentralized innovation beats centralized control. Ukraine's network of 500 suppliers can develop, test and deploy new weapons in months. Russia's rigid command structure can't adapt fast enough. Information warfare is as important as kinetic warfare. Ukraine's deception operations before Kharkiv were more effective than any weapon system in determining the battle's outcome. Technology amplifies competence, but it doesn't create it. Western weapons helped, but Ukraine's victory came from superior planning, training, and execution. Speed of decision-making is crucial. In modern warfare, the side that can observe, orient, decide, and act faster will win, regardless of numerical advantages. Logistics beats firepower. Ukraine didn't hold firm because it had more tanks or artillery. It held firm because it systematically destroyed Russia's ability to supply and command its forces. When Ukraine began the war, it was holding on for dear life to not repeat the annexation of Crimea in 2014. But at some point, this war stopped being just about holding on anymore. Ukraine has transformed from a country fighting for survival into a military power that's systematically dismantling a supposedly superior enemy. And every month the war continues, Russia's position weakens irreversibly. Russia has managed to control only roughly 18% of Ukrainian territory, much of it reduced to rubble. That territory costs Russia over 1,000 casualties per day to hold, drains resources it can't replace, and brings Russia no closer to its strategic objectives. Meanwhile, Ukraine grows stronger. Its domestic defense industry expands, its tactics evolve, its soldiers gain experience that makes them among the best trained forces in the world. Western weapons continue flowing, with fewer restrictions than ever before. And perhaps most importantly, Ukraine has proven to the world that Russia's military is a paper tiger. Putin started this war believing he could recreate the Russian Empire in 3 days. Instead, he's presided over the greatest military humiliation Russia has suffered since World War II. The special military operation has become an existential threat to Russia itself, not from Ukrainian conquest, but from the systematic collapse of Russia's military power, economic stability, and geopolitical influence. Ukraine didn't just outplay Putin, it's making him pay for that mistake with everything Russia has. And the cost keeps mounting with every passing day. Thanks for watching. Now, if you want to see a deeper analysis of Ukraine's drone revolution, check out this video. And for news on what's happening day to day on the front, subscribe to The Military Show for daily videos.